Just to start off with, I want to say that this is an extremely long video. I'm going to include a link to my script in a comment and in the video description so that you can read it if you so desire, as that may be much faster than listening to me blabbing on and going off on tangents as I am currently doing right now. Anyway, I'm making this video because it seems to me that, especially with the upcoming nerfs to Eldryon and Ragnar and the Vitruvius buff, that there is a disconnect between the reality of guild raids and the perceptions of a portion of the player base. I want to be clear that I'm not here to lord it over anyone and proclaim how dumb they are for not seeing the truth. I'll fully admit that my initial knee-jerk reaction to how negative the Vitruvius change would be for the mech team turned out to be wrong based on my further investigation into it, but there is a lot of negative sentiment towards the perceived power of the mechanical team that I think needs to be addressed. As long as the aforementioned disconnect remains, this negative sentiment is unlikely to be diffused by anything that Snowprint does, because as long as Snowprint is keeping the top two raid teams in a semblance of balance with one another, such as it is at present, it will seem like simple favouritism towards Admechs when that is not the case. What I'm hoping to do is maybe lessen the atmosphere of negativity that's making Tacticus gloomier than it needs to be, as I think many people may have seen in the comment section of Nandy's most recent video, for example. Now, if you look at my channel, you could easily surmise that I'm biased towards the Admech raid team to a large degree, but I want to keep the raid analysis of this video as objective as possible, and hopefully that will be apparent. Before I get into the weeds of the boring nerd shit, a lot of people have been saying that these changes will be a buff to the mechanical team, and I'm pretty sure that these were not well considered opinions due to them being given in the comment section of Nandy's video on the subject, where I presume many of them were hearing about it for the first time, as were my own initial thoughts to the contrary. My thoughts were incorrect as well, as I've said. People take official content creators very seriously at their words, and Nandy did mention these changes potentially being a buff to the mechanical team in the context of the Avatar of Cain fight, and I think a lot of people have blown the implications of his words out of proportion, stretching the idea of the buff being to the raid team as a whole, the mechanical raid team that is. While this inadvertently may be true, there are a whole host of other caveats and factors that need to be considered before calling it a buff necessarily. As for it being a buff to the mechanical team in the Avatar of Cain fight, I could go into detail as to why a buffer is a bad choice against the boss due to the demands of the fight revolving heavily around dealing with the boss's summons, with your own summons, and the need to replenish or supplement the ranks of your mechanical summons, or how the hits added by Vitruvius might not be worth it compared to those added by an additional mechanical summoner. But instead of all that crap, I'm just going to touch on the larger issue by simply referring you to a Pants of Horus infographic. You can find these on the game's official Discord if you are interested. I recommend them, personally, even if I do disagree with them a little bit. Sometimes. This one I don't find too objectionable. So, from this, you can see that the mechanical team is thoroughly outclassed by the multi-hit team against harder iterations of the Avatar of Cain. So any considerations there at Legendary 4 or Legendary 5 as to what Vitruvius may or may not bring to the table are ultimately moot, because you don't want to be bringing the mechs to that fight anyway. Against weaker iterations of the boss, I'm not so sure if this is a buff or not. I haven't done the maths, but those bosses are far less of an issue to get through in a raid season. I'm sure if you've ever attempted Legendary 5 Avatar of Cain, you'll be painfully aware of that fact. So I will be coming back to this sort of point, but for now, enough initial blah. I'm just going to get into the tangible mathematical substance of this video. Fair warning here, this is mostly here for the sake of completeness and to prove that I've given the topic real consideration, and that I was really just checking to make sure that these changes wouldn't be enormous. The implications of the Vitruvius buff wouldn't be too enormous, and I don't think they are. So, if you want a brief summary of what I'll be doing in this section, it looks to me like having Vitruvius on the mechanical team, being as generous as I can with how effective he would be compared to Eldryon, seems like a nerf against the Screamer Killer, at least the Legendary 2 and Legendary 3 iterations of it, and a minor buff against the Rogal Dorn tank and Szarekh. I'll put a timestamp in a comment for you to skip past this part if you so desire, which you may well want to do. So first up, let's take a look at how Ro's passive damage output will be affected by replacing Eldron with Vitruvius. So I've just made this little graph here. So this is from high ground and comparison between Ro's passive damage output with comparing when he's boosted by Vitruvius or Eldron. And from the graph, the point at which Eldron becomes the superior buffer based on the average damage output of Ro's passive, which I'm taking as being 2,500. It varies between 2,100 and 2,900, I think. So I'll now, on the basis of this, list iterations of bosses where Eldron is the superior buffer under this metric, covering just the ones where Eldron is relevant as of the current meta. So for the Screamer Killer, Eldron's better at Legendary 2, Legendary 3. For the Rogal Dorn, it's a bit iffy due to the boss's armor mechanics, and I'll be covering that more on its own sort of separate segment. For the Tervagon, this is Eldron's not an improvement for any of the iterations of that. In the Pants of Horus graphic, going back to that, they do say here that the Tervagon can appear at Legendary 4. I do have a vague recollection of that happening in the past, but I think with the introduction of Khul now as another boss, I don't think we'll be seeing the Tervagon at Legendary 4 again. I may be wrong with that, but that's just what I'm thinking at the moment. So Tervagon, I don't think the mech team will see any detriment, at least in terms of Ro's damage output is concerned. And again, with Szarekh, Vitruvius looks to be the better buffer. Also, this graph, it's limited in its range to a maximum armor stat of a boss of 2,100 at the far right end. Assuming a boss has essentially infinite armor, I think Vitruvius's bonus would actually be superior to Eldron's again. So the graphs would plateau. The lines, each the red and blue line would each plateau at a certain point when the boss's armor reaches a value where Ro's just doing his armor piercing damage value. And I think at that point, Vitruvius, the way that he buffs Ro, would actually give superior damage to Eldron. But as far as the game is currently concerned, from high ground against anything up to the Legendary 5 bosses, that's not really something that needs to be considered. It'll take a long time before we get a boss with enough armor to have Ro just not even being able to exceed the armor cap of the boss, even with someone like Eldron buffing him. Now, looking at these things here, this might seem like quite a slam dunk in favour of Vitruvius, at least as long as you're able to maintain high ground with Ro against the boss. On even ground, as is often the case against the Rogal Dorn tank, Vitruvius becomes the worst buffer at an armor stat of around a mere 650 armor. So this is also worth thinking about, but again, due to crit malarkey, that fight is a bit of an oddity, and I won't say anything more about it for the moment. Nevertheless, it would be foolish to consider only the damage output of Ro in analysing how much of a difference his change makes to the mechanical team, as despite him being its cornerstone and its main damage dealer, there are more factors at play. A lot more, in fact. As such, I will now look at some general advantages and disadvantages of the change in buffer. So, disadvantages to Vitruvius, and these are the considerations in raid battles. First up, he must remain fixed on target and not transfer his buff away from the boss, which means that he cannot handle boss summons or adds as easily as Eldron can, except by attacking them at the very start of the battle when it may not matter so much because the boss won't be in range of him anyway. A potential workaround for this is to upgrade his active and use that to kill the boss's adds and summons instead, but that would require heavy badge and gold investment to be competitive at a high legendary level, to which I say fuck off, as opposed to just using a normal attack as you would with Eldron. And also you can only use his ability once per battle, of course. He can only apply his debuff to a single target, Doom can be very useful to help your summons handle the Deathmark summons of Szarekh rapidly and keep them focused on the main target. Not having Doom available to debuff Deathmarks will make them harder to overkill and therefore more likely to screw up attacks against Szarekh via them resurrecting over and over and over and over again. Vitruvius, he adds additional hits, and the damage these hits do is dependent on the underlying level of the character/summon he is boosting. It's not a flat damage bonus like Doom. Doom provides full value regardless of the level of other team members, and this is quite a big factor that I will be harping on about. Now, the logistical considerations of this, let's face it, nobody has Vitruvius built for raids. Mech team users are being forced to toss aside one of their cornerstone characters and immediately build a new one up from scratch with barely any warning, and to this I say that's kind of bullshit. The reset stone, useless. It can be inserted into an orifice of choice for all that's worth. It's not going to convert those Xenos badges into Imperial badges. It's not going to convert those Eldari resources into Imperial resources. So, whatever, really. Other than that, he will make it harder to farm items for the mechanical team from scratch. Rare items for the mechanical team can only be farmed from a single elite node daily, 3 a day for 4 characters that you want to be built up to very high level to be competitive in this team. And the legendary items for the Adeptus Mechanicus, they can only be farmed from 2 nodes. So this is even more of a bottleneck now in terms of time when building the team up from scratch. On top of this, Vitruvius is a natural legendary that once he's out of the guild shop and rogue trader, he must be farmed using the atrocious drop rates of the campaign event. Good luck farming him from the Extremis node without 2 unfarmable characters as well. So, what's that? 10 attempts at farming him per day if you don't have Pastilian and Corrodius. It's kind of awful. You've got 300 shards total that drop from the milestone crates in the campaign event, but progress here is glacial without the ability to progress through the entirety of both campaigns, and even with that at the end it still leaves 200 shards to farm. Eldrion, on the other hand, can be farmed from an elite node. He's a permanent fixture of the guild shop, and he is available as a requisition milestone reward. Yeah, I know that's not happening, but it's still an option. And he has a base rarity of rare, making him far easier to just unlock in the first place, and then you can use onslaughts if you so desire to speed up the ascension process for him. It's not all doom and gloom though. There are some advantages to Vitruvius. He doesn't need to be kept at range 2 from the boss once his buff has been applied, and he's also free to heal friendly units afterwards if necessary. And that gives him a lot more tactical flexibility in terms of potentially being able to both support the team and obstruct a boss's movement compared to Eldrion. Although I've never had a problem with this when using Eldrion, so it's kind of, whatever. He's a mechanical unit, so he can be healed by members of the team, such as Aleph and Actus, which makes him a lot less fragile than Eldrion. I think he's tougher as well, so he can certainly weather a lot more damage and then be recovered from that. And it may also give Actus an extra friendly unit to trigger with his active ability if you place Vitruvius correctly. He's able to trigger Rose passive with his attacks, which Eldrion is obviously unable to do, not being mechanical. The extra hit provided by Vitruvius potentially allows characters to score longer crit chains, though the crit chance of Ro, the main damage dealer, the chance of him scoring a crit with his third hit on any given attack is a mere 6.4%. So that goes for both his passive and his normal attacks. So even though he does attack many, many times over the course of an average battle, this will probably only shake out to be maybe 3 or 4 extra crits over the course of a battle, maybe 5. Again, the Rogal Dorn tank, the fight against that bucks this trend with the weaker rear armor trait, and it may be worthy of additional consideration. These are the main things that I could think of for now, and now I'd like to dive into some practical examples of boss fights with Vitruvius. So, practical examples. The bosses that Vitruvius may cover: he's in contention for use against the Rogal Dorn tank, Szarekh, the Tervigon and the Screamer Killer, as far as I can tell. Looking at previous videos of mine, we can take a look at how much of a difference this would make per battle. Before I do this, I'm going to be using the word delta to denote the change in damage dealt by a unit going from being boosted by Eldryon to being boosted by Vitruvius. This can be a positive or a negative value depending on which buffer is better, and while the amount of damage that Eldryon adds is modified by hits scored, Vitruvius adds more the higher the levels of the units he is boosting. For the sake of giving Vitruvius the best advantage I possibly can in light of this, I'll assume that the characters and units that I'm using in these replays are fully maxed out, but this is already a demerit to Vitruvius, as an underleveled team boosted by level 50 Doom will get the maximum value out of that buff, whereas Vitruvius's buff is greatly diminished when used by weak units. On top of this, I'll assume that Vitruvius is affected by his own passive. I'm not entirely sure how the changed ability is going to work, but I assume that's how it's going to work, hopefully, because that'll be a bit more damage. And I'll also be assuming that no additional hits that he grants to attacks will be limited by his passive damage cap. Shosil, for example, his attack, if he scored a crit and he's attacking from high ground, I could well see him actually exceeding the damage cap that Vitruvius is allowed to place on his additional hits. So that is something fairly minor to consider, because I think the cap will be quite generously high, at least. I'll also be assuming that Eldryon and Vitruvius are exactly interchangeable in how they're used, which for all intents and purposes they are. They have the same movement and same effective range, and they don't have any traits like unstoppable or flying that might make a significant difference to how you might want to move them around. So now let's look at how the new and potentially improved mechanical team fares against a Screamer Killer. So this will be a legendary free Screamer Killer, and if you go into the document, I'll have the video is hyperlinked there, but I'll also link it in the description of this video. So these assumptions break down a bit when it comes to Galatian, the assumptions that I just listed off, because in the video I only have him at a very low level, and if I had him at level 50, or a level where he'd be able to face tank the Screamer Killer's attacks, I wouldn't put him where I do in the video. I'd put him in the location where he'd be able to be re-triggered by Tan. For the purpose of this analysis, I'll assume that Galatian is on high ground relative to the boss, and able to be re-triggered twice per round by Tan in terms of his damage output, but I'll keep the number of triggers of Rose passive over the course of the battle the same. If you think I'm being slimy by doing this, and you want to say that I didn't do this in the video, and so therefore it can't be done, because it works out massively in favour of Eldryon over Vitruvius, you can watch Painhawk's attempts at this map, the channel Painhawk on YouTube, and you'll see that this is very much possible to do. Rose passive and active abilities benefit more from Eldryon than Vitruvius in this case, so don't think of me as not including additional hits as skewing the numbers in Eldryon's favour. In fact, the opposite is true. If anything, that's making it more favourable to Vitruvius. Like I say, there are lots of limitations to what I'm doing here, but I don't think they'll be too significant in the grand scheme of things, and I think they'll prove my point anyway. So now let's look at the maths. So we've got 5 hits from Vitruvius possible, 2 while Rose active is online, which leads to 71 triggers of Rose passive over the course of the battle, 29 while the active is online, and also you've got 2 attacks from Ro while the active is online. So in total, Vitruvius, from his 5 attacks, triggering Ro to hit 3 times with his passive, each time he's triggered, will score 15 hits, plus an additional 4 from the 2 times that Ro will be triggered whilst he has his active ability online. The total average damage of these additional hits, taking boss armor into account, will be plus 41,205 damage to the total delta that I'll be calculating here. And now you can just sort of see the maths that I've done. In terms of the deltas, I've calculated them for each individual character for the summons, and I I singled out Optimized Gate and Chord Claw, the damage of those abilities, because they're significant enough to require their own categories for consideration. And, I don't really need to go through all this. I'll just say, I've taken high ground into account and how many times certain types of units have attacked from high ground. So the Skitari, for example, that's why you've got the multipliers of 11 and 31 there. So they attacked 11 times from high ground and 31 times from even ground relative to the boss. Taken armor piercing as appropriate into account, whether armor piercing is used or the armor cap is exceeded to the point where the armor piercing value of an attack doesn't need to be used. So I think I've been fairly thorough here, and the upshot of all of this is that the total delta is roughly equivalent to minus 200,000 damage over the course of the whole battle. So clearly that is a somewhat significant reduction in the overall effectiveness of the team. This boss has its armor debuffed as well. If your guild wants to skip fighting the Winged Prime, which my guild didn't for the sake of this replay, the disparity between Eldron and Vitruvius would be even worse. But wait, I hear you say, this is an example of a boss where Eldron is a better buffer for Rose passive than Vitruvius, as per my little graph, wherever that's gone to, here. Because the Screamer Killer in this situation has an armor stat of around 1,400, where Eldron is clearly a superior choice. So what about bosses where Eldron is worse? Fair enough. That's worthy of consideration. So let's take a look at the Legendary 5 Szarekh, a boss that has low armor, and that you'll be bringing Shosil to attack, a character that benefits very much from Vitruvius over Eldron. So Legendary 5 Szarekh. So you've got me just saying how many hits Vitruvius will add, etc. And it needs to be said that due to lacking Doom in this fight, the boss summons may be more difficult for my summons to kill, and also potentially my characters if I'm redirecting my characters to kill them. And therefore that would end up subtracting from the number of times that Rose passive gets triggered over the course of the attack. So that's, again, a detriment to using Vitruvius that I haven't taken into consideration. Instead, I'll just be generous and assume that Doom would make no difference to how distracting the death marks are. And again, going through all of the different deltas, you've got the sniper drones again. The only real difference here in terms of things to consider is not having Galatian on the field, which works out quite good for Vitruvius because the total delta, as I calculate it, comes out to roughly plus 20,000. So it's a slight, it's this boss fight, I'd say it's pretty much a best case scenario for Vitruvius. You're not using Galatian, the boss has extremely low armor, and Shosil is included in the fight. Between Ro and Tan, 45 2-hit attacks would be made over the course of this battle, and at a 6.4% crit chance on both, that would lead you to expect 3 extra crits over having Eldron as well, and you can throw in an extra crit from Shosil on top of that to bring you to a total of 4 extra crits over the course of the battle, which would bring your positive delta a little higher, maybe up to around, say, 25,000-30,000. Bear in mind that in the original attack that I'm basing this analysis on, I did over 1 million damage total, so in the grand scheme of things, this is a difference in damage of a few percent. Also to be remembered is the favourable assumption made towards the level of distraction provided by death marks. On this map, when Szarekh comes down on the first turn, it is exceedingly easy to block death mark spawns, but you will be dealing with more death marks in every other situation, so if he comes down on the second turn, it gets hairier, and on any other Szarekh map, I don't think it's anywhere near as easy to block as many death marks from spawning as I do here. So it can be assumed from this that the post-nerf mech team will be somewhere on a scale between potentially a little better than before to considerably worse against bosses with normal defensive stats. On that note, the last boss I want to go over is the Rogal Dorn, which is a special case due to its weaker rear armor and ablative plating traits. So, if you watch the run, during the run I'm using a knife on Ro, and I think Sorry, I'm using a crit pistol on Ro, whereas I think a combat knife would actually be the optimal choice here. So I'll be making my calculations based on the assumption that Ro has a maxed legendary combat knife and maxed crit booster. And this was just me working some stuff out before I got into working out all of the deltas. Some of this I didn't end up using in the end, but you can see how I'm figuring out how many crits you might expect to get additionally with the extra hit from Vitruvius, which was the main thing I was thinking about here. So the total delta with all of this taken into account, and this was quite difficult, and you'll see I've got the estimated tan and Ro delta there, and I'll get around to why that is. So the total delta is probably about 20,000. So again, like with Szarekh, a slight improvement with the addition of Vitruvius in place of Eldryon, although my total damage output against the tank in this video was, I think, 570,000 damage, so a 20,000 increase proportionally represents it represents more of an improvement with Vitruvius than it does against Szarekh. For the sake of simplicity in this, I did make a lot of assumptions. So I've assumed incorrectly that each time a crit fails with Ro's active online, it will be a Cold Claw hit, and that the probability of Cold Claw scoring a crit from in front of the tank after 2 or 3 preceding hits is negligible. It seems that even with the extra crits, hits, and triggers provided to optimized gate by Vitruvius, the increase in damage in that case still does not compensate for the loss in damage from missing out on Doom whenever Cold Claw is online. Combining that with the precipitous loss in damage output from the Skitarii, overall this isn't really much of a buff to the mechanical team, at least of this composition, which I believe is the highest performing one for the mechanical team against a tank on most maps. And I missed out on tossing up the additional damage Tan and Ro would deal with their normal attacks with Vitruvius. The results for optimized gates have informed the estimates of improvement I've given for this damage. I would have done the maths for their normal attacks, but the Markov chains fried my brain. I'll just say it. There's no reason other than my brain was just totally fried and I couldn't deal with it anymore. I feel like I'm most likely to have made a mistake in this section of the analysis. I'm not a statistician by any stretch, so feel free to correct me if you think I'm wrong on any of this stuff. I won't pretend that what I've done here is necessarily conclusive with these 3 analyses. All I've done is go over a mere few of my own replays, which I hope are representative of high-level mech team play, but I'm confident enough in what I've done and my own experience of how the team works to say that I think these changes will be mostly inconsequential in terms of theory crafting to the mechanical team's effectiveness against the bosses where Eldryon is a top pick. Again, I think it is also very important to stress that your characters don't end up a Diamond 3 winged star with level 50 abilities by magic. It takes a huge amount of time, grinding and effort to reach that level just for one character, let alone all the characters you need to run the mechanical team optimally and have options for every single boss that it can be used against. All you need for Eldryon, as he currently stands to operate at nearly full capacity, is to have Doom at level 50. And I say nearly full because you can upgrade his active ability to squeeze a bit more damage out of that, and you can get him to Diamond 3 to squeeze a bit more damage out of his normal attacks, but realistically, all of his contribution to the mechanical raid team is from his passive ability, as things currently stand. So, for Vitruvius to operate at full capacity, everything in a team that deals damage must be maxed out. And this is in a team that already guzzles Imperial resources, especially now that building Helbrecht is much more important for optimal performance. This cannot simply be brushed aside as an irrelevance when it comes to theory crafting maximum damage output of a team. I mean, you could, but your theorizing would be irrelevant to all but the most bloated of whales. Me personally, I'm a year deep into using the mech team avidly, without paying for it, and I still don't even have Galatian, Ifana, Golgorts, or Anifet built to anywhere near a satisfactory level for high-end raids. I could go over each individual boss at each rarity level in turn here, but based on what benefits and what suffers from replacing Eldron with Vitruvius in general, I think you should be able to build a reasonable picture for yourself with the aid of an excellent infographic from Pants of Horus, entitled The Admech Team's Best Raid Characters. And I don't disagree with that much at all. So I think going into what I've been doing here would be missing the point of the hubbub around these changes. Now, some people are currently upset about how Ro hasn't been directly nerfed by this most recent rash of changes, despite it in their eyes being overdue. Most of these people, from what I've seen, are taking the reasonable view that although the multi-hit team will be negatively affected by upcoming nerfs, Vitruvius may be a worthy, if not superior, replacement for Eldron as part of a mechanical composition. What sours this change even more in the eyes of a significant subset of this group is that, in their eyes, the mechanical team is already the best raid team in the game, and I think this ultimately is where the crux of the issue lies. And this, again, is why I haven't gone any further into analysing the differences between Vitruvius and Eldron. The work had to be done just to see if it looked likely for there to be any dramatic shifts in effectiveness, but at the end of the day, quibbling over a little change in damage dealt against the Rogal Dorn tank, the Screamer Killer or Tervagon is, in my view, an irrelevance. So, why do I say this? Well, let me give an extreme example to outline my point. Say a raid boss has 20 hit points, and I improve my potential maximum damage against it from 1 million to 1,500,000. Does that change matter? No. Of course, this isn't exactly the case for raids, but let's consider the legendary raid team infographic from Pants of Horus once again for a moment. Let's go and find that right at the start. So taking another look at it. Now, bear in mind here that I don't think the Tervagon can appear at Legendary 4 any longer, and what jumps out about this infographic here is that the mechanical team, where it shines, is against low-tier bosses with limited health. The exceptions to this are Szarekh and Mortarion, who I think in this infographic has erroneously been labelled as a Neurothrope boss. I disagree with that, I think it is a mech team boss. Now, mechs with Helbrecht can put out decent damage against Magnus in comparison to a multi-hit team, but accounting for the RNG of the fight every time, with a team as intricate to use as mechs, as well as a larger margin of error, make high-level Magnus fights the mental equivalent of being Git mode when you're using the Adeptus Mechanicus. You can call it my Admech bias if you want, but for the amount of effort involved for each fight, I deserve whatever goddamn damage I can claw out of it. But back to the main point, the biggest, baddest bosses are firmly the domain of the multi-hit team, and this is not a trivial point. And this is why people like me are kind of tired of hearing about the multi-hit team being second best. Against trash and side bosses that would take relatively few tokens to kill, regardless of whether the mech team existed or not, sure. Against bosses that have enormous stats and tough adds that suck up tons of tokens, and act as the most major roadblocks to progress through the guild raid season, no. Now, there is one fairly well subscribed to official creator. I'm not going to name any names, but it rhymes with Draupnir. Now, this creator will take every opportunity possible to whinge about how overpowered the mech team is, and how they're the best raid comp, and how the fucking sky is falling down. Now, keep in mind that this is not taking into account upcoming nerfs, but as things currently stand, but this is the opinions that I am citing here, they are taken as things currently stand in the raid meta. Now, if I were assuming good faith on the part of this anonymous YouTuber, I would simply invite him to ask some of the top guilds, the ones who have to operate in the real world and actually get results, about the spread of raid teams that they use within their guilds and how many raid tokens each one covers per season. Now, if the mechanical team were so obviously superior, it would be pretty evident in its level of usage being at least somewhat greater than that of any other of the mainline raid teams, but I'm confident that this is not borne out in reality. These issues that he flags up with the mech team were certainly valid a year, maybe even 6 months ago, but they simply don't hold water anymore. In terms of nerfs, the mech team has received to its position In the meta, I could mention the following. So there's the Mortarion armor increase, the Mortarion Plague Wind buff, increasing its damage against summons, Mortarion AI changes, making him more likely to kill your Skitari. You've got the Avatar of Cain knockback being adjusted to deal damage more broadly. That may not mean much to you if you're not familiar with using the mech team, but it can make it a lot harder for Skitari to survive boss fights, especially at Legendary 2 and Legendary 3. There's been the introduction of Magnus, who is a patently anti-row boss. You've had the introduction of Cool, a boss where row is unusable, and you've had the rework of the orcs and the development of the orc multi-hit meta to elevate the multi-hit team with respect to the mechanical team. The last 4 of these in particular have seriously cut into the effectiveness of the mechanical team relative to multi-hit teams. Thanks to the boss tiering system, Khal and Ghazghkull, bosses a classic row strategy is unusable against, now both being available to fight at Legendary 2 and 3 further sidelines row by taking up slots in the Legendary boss rota at levels where row is most effective. In the current raid season, I've had to sit with my thumb up my arse while my guild handled Khal and Ghazghkull at Legendary 2 and Legendary 3 respectively. And luckily I managed to make myself useful by killing Gibber Scraps, but that was about all I could realistically do of any use with my favoured raid team. I doubt that we'll be having any more double Szarekh raid seasons either with the introduction of Khal. I may be wrong on that, but again, this is a blow to the mechanical team as they are highly effective against Szarekh. In fact, the boss tiering system change, the biggest nerf to the mech team of all in my opinion on its own, was enough of a nerf to Admechs to warrant reset stones, because it resulted in the situation that you can see in the Pants of Horus Optimum Legendary Raid Team infographic that I'm not going to scroll up to again, but I'm sure you're intimately familiar with by this point. It resulted in the situation you see there where the mech team just really aren't very good at tackling any of the higher level bosses with the exception of Mortarion and Szarekh. Now, me personally, I originally didn't build Row up to a high diamond level to dunk on trash bosses. I did it so that he could survive and make something out of an encounter with a Legendary 5 Screamer Killer, but I guess screw me and my Legendary Badge investment into Tan's active ability, which I was building up for that fight. I guess that just gets whipped away and I'm left holding the bag. And to the multi-hit users who are complaining about how shit reset stones are, I agree. And I sympathise, but the chances are with the changes that are upcoming, you won't even need them. And also consider yourself lucky that even if you do use them, you got more than the literal nothing that mech team users did, as the effectiveness of the team was steadily fucked into the dirt without Snowprint even acknowledging these nerfs beyond informing us of the facts of the matter. Now, do I think that those nerfs to the mech team were necessary? Absolutely. But having that as a thing that exists in the game, the mech team as it was when it was released, forcing people to chase it to be competitive before shitting all over them is far worse than the namby-pamby, oh we're so sorry, Eldron and Ragnar changes currently about to take effect, and I took it just fine. And I had to because I didn't get anything for it. Your Snortflogger and your Khan, they won't start dealing no damage because their passives can't be boosted by Eldron anymore. They were already meta against bosses where Eldron wasn't usable, and they're still good to use alongside Ragnar. If anyone is telling you that you should be irate about what is happening to the multi-hit team, don't just take them at their word, not even official creators who are, I have to say, wrong all the time. And I'm not even an official creator, so imagine how wrong I might be, you know. So by all means, flag me up on anything you think I'm saying here that's wrong. But all effectiveness of characters in terms of the guild raid meta is relative, and I sincerely believe that you don't need to worry about wasted investment as far as Khan and Snortflogger are concerned. I've heard multi-hit players say that they feel betrayed by these changes and uncertain about the future of raids for their preferred team, and I've heard further gripes about there being some favouritism towards Admechs coming from the direction of the game devs. Now, I don't think that you could look at the facts of the situation and come to the conclusion that there is any favouritism involved here. At least Snowprint acknowledged the hammer blow that they were taking to the multi-hit team in these upcoming changes. Mech team users are expected to just have excrement squeezed into their mouths, with nerf after nerf after nerf after nerf, passing by without even a hint of acknowledgement about the negative effects that this will have on people's investments, let alone any recompense. Talk about uncertainty. If you want the sword of Damocles hanging over your head, build a mech team. I'll be candid for a moment and say that I was strongly considering not even building Vitruvius and moving away from the mech team after hearing about the nature of the upcoming nerfs and buffs, because I'm already so sick of having my favoured team constantly messed with, while multi-hits teams in comparison seem like an oasis of relative stability and relevance to higher level raid content. I decided to carry on playing them, at least for now, because I enjoy using them greatly, and I smile every time my mech team does good damage versus Morty or Magnus, because it's done in the knowledge that someone at Snowprint thought it wouldn't be possible, because that's all the compensation I get for the seemingly open-ended cascade of nerfs. Nevertheless, I'm still building a multi-hit team for whenever Ro and friends may get destroyed beyond recovery, and I have been building them for quite some time, so welcome to the club, multi-hitters. I'll say that at least we're not in the Neurothrope boat, waiting for an opportunity to even become meta-relevant. Now, it's obvious that the mechanical team was never intended to be as strong as it turned out to be, and it's been on the chopping block ever since Snowprint got wind of how out of line they were. I think in the light of this, talk of favouritism is simply absurd. The only reason the team hasn't been rendered completely useless outside of trash and side boss cleanup is because Snowprint seems incapable of balancing them without directly nerfing Ro. Their interaction with Helbrecht is the final vestige they have of anything that would make them useful against higher tier bosses, outside of Szarekh. Now, that was a very long aside, and back to the content creator I was talking about. On his part, I don't assume good faith when it comes to his claims about the mech team being number one, because up to this point, in terms of his content, I've been impressed by his insight into the game's mechanics, more so than many other official creators, and I don't think all of what I just described could pass you by without at least a heavy dose of willful ignorance. If I were being cynical, I might surmise from this John Doe's most recent videos, where he professes to hate seemingly most, if not all, aspects of the game, whilst also somehow claiming that he loves it, that he is burnt out, he's about to quit, and wants to take as many parting shots as possible against a part of the game that he has a personal vendetta against, and that this behaviour is not being driven by ignorance but actual malice. Personally, I could understand being frustrated as a Neurothrope user, having your favoured team be shunted out of its top tier position against Morty by the mech team, and how that might make you seethe and lash out. Now, I'm all for top performing raid teams to be reined in, and the Neurothrope to be buffed to allow greater diversity in the raid meta. In fact, I welcome these recent changes, excluding the logistical difficulties in either adjusting a pre-existing mech team or building one from scratch that have now been introduced. But using this as an excuse to amplify your incessant shrieking about how the mech team is overpowered relative to all other teams, riling up and inculcating a false persecution complex in multi-hit team users that look up to you as a font of useful information, when by all rights you should know what you're saying is nonsense, is inexcusable. Accusing people who defend the mech team against your attacks, people like me now, I guess, as having bias and motivated reasoning before immediately going on to conveniently only discuss Mortarion as a high-level boss that the mech team is good against, as if that's the norm, rather than an extreme outlier, really is the most galling part of your theoretical video. Draupnir, name unrelated, endlessly yaps about the nerfs, starting at around the 850 mark, for those who are interested in looking. To the point where, frankly, if you are this hypothetical YouTuber that is doing this, well,
you need to shut the fuck up!